Well, I'll begin today on section 20 to 25 of PPA. And I want to make some remarks about those, and I'll go over more or less each section, indicating some things that I think we have to look at. I hope you will find helpful. In a way, it's a little bit tedious, perhaps, but I hope not, and I hope eventually it is going to help understand what's going on. And I might comment, though, before I begin, that about 2 lectures for classes we had on Kant, I always feel it's hard to say anything useful at all about Kant in such a short period of time. So perhaps to guide you in thinking about the topics that we talked about and guide you into reading, I think there are 2 important things to get straight if possible. One would be the general structure of the CI procedure, the way in which it was set out, and the general idea involved in subjecting rational constraints, step 1 of rational sincere agents, to the constraints that are contained in the categorical imperative or the moral law. I think that idea is an important idea, and the idea that the moral law has this priority over the rational and subordinates it absolutely. I think there's a contrast between any view like that and a teleological view, say like utilitarianism, but it would not have to be utilitarianism, that define the notion of the good independently from the right, and then they define the right as maximizing the good. That's a rather sharp contrast there, and I think it's not always understood how it's to be explained. At least I believe that to be so, and that's more understanding, I think. So you have within the framework of Kant's view a number of different notions of the good that kind of built up. But I won't go into that. But the idea is that you have a different kind of structure to a moral view of that kind than you have in theological view as it is defined in the book, in the text. The other idea is just the idea of the original contract, an idea of reason, and what the notion of reason sort of means for Kant. It's hard to convey that, but even though that can't be conveyed fully without going into a lot of background that we don't have time for, nevertheless, you can get the notion that, first of all, for Kant, the original contract is an idea, and it has no historical implications at all. It's sort of how one would understand from a philosophical point of view how the state and its citizens could be combined into a unit of some sort. Help us to understand that. Then the other use of it that Kant makes is as a criterion or principle that helps us to understand what the sovereign can do. So that, for example, when Kant argues against the hereditary class in theory of rights, he says that that is in violation of the idea of an original contract. People could not possibly agree to that, and that limits what the sovereign can do. So it is actually employed by Kant on a number of occasions as a principle, you might say the highest order of principle of rights. Well, maybe I don't have to say the highest order, I just say a very high order of principle of rights. that limits of what the Scotland can do. So in that respect, it has a criterion, and you don't have anything like some rightly conducted historical process and so on. Well, so I think if you focus on those things, then I would hope that the time that we spend on something is going to be worth it. So I'll begin on section 20 and 25 and make some comments on these and hope to be able to help you, to guide you through this chapter. Now recall earlier that we discussed three reasons for using the idea, for introducing the idea of the original position. The first was that we use it to carry out the idea of the basic structure of society as a system of cooperation in which the fair terms of the cooperation are specified by citizens regarded solely as free and equal persons. So I had to get some idea, some way of thinking how we could get a point of view where the notion of agreement was to be applied to the basic structure. That was the first thing, and that's on handout number 2, A22. The second reason for introducing the idea of DOC was as a fair agreement situation that would help us determine which principles of justice are most appropriate to the freedom and equality of citizens in a democratic society. And what we want to do is to have this determination made by citizens themselves when they are fairly represented solely as free and equal persons, and as the assumption I'm also making that they are normally cooperating members of society over a complete life, although we haven't said very much about that. So first it is to find us a perspective, a point of view from which we can apply the notion of agreement to the basic structure. The other is actually to work out in some way what principles citizens themselves so represented would agree to. And we hope that by doing this, we'll be able to get a better understanding of how to balance or compromise or whatever the claims of freedom and equality. The third reason that I mentioned, when I just mentioned, is also in handout 2, the third page of handout 2, which is 2.3. The third reason I mentioned was that we use the original position as the focal point within which and through which I consider convictions on questions of justice at all levels of generality can be brought to bear on one another until they finally, or so we hope, fall into line so that they fit together, can be made after some revisions or other to cohere into, you might say, a coherent conception of justice, at any rate to a sufficient degree as to support and to sustain social cooperation and a footing of equality. So those are three things, three reasons for introducing the OP so far that I have mentioned, and the last one is on page 3.3, the third handout. Now, I have repeated these because you're going to introduce a fourth reason. I'm sorry, there may be more with this, but in a way I hope to hang together to a certain extent. The fourth way is that we think of the original position as a way of embedding into an agreement situation reasonable constraints on arguments for principles of justice for the basic structure. Now, these constraints are regarded as reasonable in view of our consider the convictions. Now the idea is this, that we might say that in everyday life we have the capacity to reason about and reflect about and discuss with one another what plausible or acceptable principles for the basic structure might be. And we're all able to do that. That's the assumption. And we all have the capacity to say, that would not be a reasonable principle, or that would not be a reasonable argument for principle of political justice, and to give some explanation for that. And the idea is that if we impose certain kind of constraints on these arguments and embed those in the original position, then we may be able to model or reflect or capture what these considered convictions are. So the idea would be that if we did this correctly or right, then principles that it would be rational for the parties to accept would be principles that we regarded as reasonable. Now, the reason that would happen, might happen, is that we embed in the original position certain constraints on how the parties are able to reason. For example, they are not to know various things. So any reasons that they give or have in the original position will not be based on information that we exclude from them. So whereas in everyday life, it might be rational for us to use those grounds for urging principles on other people if we thought they could be persuaded or made to accept them. We might think in everyday life, although that's rational, that would be an unreasonable view pressed on people. So what we want to do is to embed constraints in the OP, in the original position on slide number that, so that rational people use the same kind of arguments that we think would be reasonable. And so it's a kind of a model or intended to capture what our reasoning in everyday life is insofar as we regard our reasoning as expression or in line with our considered conviction. Now that may give a simple example. There is one in the book of similar kind. It would be rational, say, for me, if I knew I was powerful or something of that sort, to urge on people principle that powerful people should have a certain advantage. I might be able to have that agreed to. Other people, presumably I would too, think that would be unreasonable or unfair, even though from a point of view it might be rational. So, in order to try and capture of what's happening here, I would say, and the text says, suppose we don't know that we are powerful, then it would no longer be rational to urge that principle. And let's assume. So I would not urge that principle on that reason, and therefore it would not, he suggested, it would not be argued for as a principle of justice when the parties are subject to that constraint. So, in general, what the, say, scale of ignorance does is works in that way. It embeds a variety of constraints on argument, and how rational people can argue. The idea being that if we do that correctly, well, then the principles that the parties will agree to are then fair, or manageable in the sense that they would match our consider their convictions. So that's the general idea of embedding into original position these sorts of constraints. And this idea is a very important feature of the original position, and it's noted in a variety of places in TJ. I have them on the sheet, so I won't read them out here. But I urge you to read these over. It's only a few pages all told. Read them together, and I think you will get the general idea. At least I hope you will. And there's also a checklist on page 146 to 47 of all the elements in this position, and the asterisk there indicates the interpretation. And if you're in doubt, that's what that's arguing for. The sections are indicated to where you get the explanation. Okay, so that is so much by general account of what is going on. So let's begin with section 20. And I'll go right through to 25 if I get time making a few comments about it. Now the remarks in the earlier, that I gave earlier in handouts 1 to 5 already go over and summarize some points in this section. So I'll just focus on a few matters here. First of all, I'll begin with saying something about the comparison between arguments in social theory and the kind of arguments that I have in mind is, say, in economics, the elementary theory of the household, or say, of consumer behavior, is a good example of the kind of thing I have in mind. And the argument from the original position, much of yes, as an analogy between arguments of this type. In each case, what we have is rational persons making decisions or arriving at agreements subject to various conditions and constraints that are fairly clearly specified. So that if we know these persons' knowledge and their beliefs, if we know their desires and interests, and if we know the alternatives that they face, as well as the consequences that they expect to follow from each alternative if they adopt it, then we're able to form some idea of what they will decide to do or what they will agree to. Unless, of course, they make some mistake in their reasoning or otherwise fail to act rationally. Now, I'm assuming that parties in original position are artificially defined people, so they reason and behave exactly the way in which we say they will, that is, if we describe them correctly. This is said, I believe, if I'm recalling it correctly, on page 147, although actually I'm not sure of that. But these are artificially defined people acting as we describe them in view of the assumptions that we give them, as far as we can do that. Now, if this situation, this kind of situation is specified by the use of mathematical assumptions, then we may be able to prove what these persons will do, of course, on the assumption that the premises we lay down indeed hold. Now, while there is this analogy between these arguments in social theory and the argument from the original position, there is an important and really fundamental difference between them, and I want to emphasize this, and it's emphasized on page 120 to 21. One differences in social theory, we are concerned to describe and to explain how individuals act in various situations, how institutions actually work, and so on. Whereas trying to develop a critical conception of justice is another matter altogether, quite different aim from that. So instead of describing rational persons as we find them, what we do is to interpret them as representatives of free and equal citizens in a democratic society, and we impose on these persons who have now become the parties within this construction certain reasonable conditions and constraints that are supposed to reflect constraints on arguments that we think to be reasonable. Now, essential here is a distinction between the reasonable and the rational, and this parallel constant distinction between the hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative. Just as the Kant's CI procedure subjects agents' rational and sincere maximus step 1 to the constraints of their procedure that are contained in steps 2 to 3, and thus restricts the agent's conduct by the requirements of the moral law. So these reasonable conditions that are imposed on the parties in the original position restrict the kind of arguments that they can give, and in that way we have the same thing in each case. As I'm making an analogy of Wittgenstein's view, we can say in each case that reasonable has priority over the rational, and subordination absolutely. Now, the other day, someone asked about the sense of reasonable and rational. I think at the moment, just regard these as labels, that labels to assert and reform what's an important point. If you want to ask what's meant, why then we have to go back to the contrast, the Kant's view between the categorical imperative and the hypothetical imperative, and the contrast between what we are attempting to do with the conditions imposed on the parties in the original position and the account of parties as rational. Now, observe that the aim of the argument from the original position is, if possible, to establish a deductive argument, even if the reasoning is presented, and I don't think we'll be able to get beyond this in any way, even if the reasoning presented is short of that standard. Now, the point is that the acceptance of the two principles, or the argument for the two principles, isn't supposed to be based on some conjecture of what people's psychology might be in that situation. It doesn't depend on some psychological law of some kind that we have to conjecture what it is, even after all the premises are laid down. Consider as a parallel the kind of analogy I had in mind, kind of argument I had in mind. The argument that one finds, again, in elementary accounts of the household, one would say that the household's agent, if you're not familiar with this, don't worry about it. If you are, you will, I think, see the point of it, is that the household's agent, when it goes to market, whoever the agent is, the head of the family or someone that they hire to go to market or whatever, will purchase a commodity bundle that is indicated by the point in what is sometimes called a commodity space, that is where the budget line is just tangent to the highest indifference curve. And given the assumptions that are made, and if you draw a picture, few enough dimensions, well, that's obvious. And there are a lot of dimensions, it's easy to prove. So in that sense, all of the premises that you have made, assume that they hold, and assume that those are all the elements involved, you can simply prove that result. So any psychology that's accepted about the household or how its agents behave are already in the premises. And therefore you're presumably able to give a proof. And the same thing ideally might be the case, ought to be the case, in the original idea was in this argument from the original position. Of course it does not achieve that standard, but still, it's not supposed to depend on what the psychology of people might be in this somewhat extraordinary situation, because who in heavens knows what it might be, and the point is it doesn't matter. If we do it right, what we're building into it is these reasonable constraints. And we're doing that because we want to know what all those constraints imply. It's a device for trying to figure out what our own considered convictions, if properly organized and articulated, would lead to. And that's why we don't want it to depend on some psychological conjecture about how people would behave in that situation. That, from my standpoint, is totally irrelevant, and we want to avoid it if possible. So the psychology is included, so far as we can, in the presumptions that we've already set up. And each of these presumptions we can support by reasons of some kind, is why we are including that. Okay, am I making any sense? Well, we'll go ahead. So we come to 21, presentations of the alternative. Now, two very brief remarks. TJ does not attempt to say, or to give any account of what principles of justice parties might think up in this situation. What would they might produce as alternatives? Because to do that would be very complicated business. Obviously, if you reflect about it, well, we have to give a rather elaborate psychological account of how people could possibly think up things like principles of justice and all that. And that is extremely difficult, I think. I'm not sure if that is a coherent enterprise. But even if it is coherent, would, I think, be very difficult, so that's not attempted. What is done by us, that is, by you and me who are setting up this framework, in order to try to work out what's involved in all of our considered as convictions, what we do is to hand the parties a list, or what we might call, to make a divot, a menu, of some sort, and we put on the menu the well-known and traditional views that have had an important place in the history of our moral and tradition of political thought. So we try to test out in this kind of a preliminary way by seeing which of these views that has a history to it and is important, is preferable from this point of view. We hope that by doing that, we'll gain some insight, some understanding of the nature of these views and why one is better than another. Now, of course, this is another point, so comment or an addendum to the first one, is that such a procedure cannot establish, I mean, if we just have a short menu, a short list, that won't establish what is the best of all possible, or most appropriate of all possible conceptions of justice. It falls far short of that. But I think given where we are historically, it's enough for us if we could just have an idea of those that have existed and that we know about, if we could make some decision among them. That would be instructive. In other words, we have to aim to do something that we can accomplish and not aim for too much. Mainly the idea of trying to find the best of all possible conceptions. That, I think, is probably beyond our reach. It may not be, but let's assume it is, and at any rate begin in this other more mundane but more practicable way. So the thing that I have to add, and that actually this other point is, notice that the principles are accepted, whichever ones they are not as principles in terms of their content. They are not derived from the other conditions of the original position. That is, say, if we enumerate all of the conditions and we leave the menu aside, we track back, then we can't derive a menu from these other conditions. We just have to hand it to them. So, what the original position does, or this whole apparatus, it selects from given menu. It's a selection device. And we have to feed something into it to get anything out. Put it that way. Okay, that's all that. Or is this awfully tedious going through this stuff? I know it is tedious. Or do you know all of this? If anybody has questions they want to ask, I mean, you know, I don't have to get through everything I'm doing. So feel free to raise a question if it's very obscure or something. Well, if they're not questions, then I go on to 22, the circumstances of justice. Now, these are intended to reflect some general aspects of historical conditions under which modern democratic societies exist. I'm not going to say anything about the objective circumstances. Perhaps they're clear enough, but I might comment on the subjective ones. Those are terms that I use in this section. Now, it's best to think of the subjective circumstances as reflecting the fact that in a modern democratic state, as I mentioned in this stuff before, that citizens affirm a different and indeed incommensurable and irreconcilable conceptions of the good. Now, later on, I hope we get a chance to say what incommensurable means, but it means there isn't a way somehow to measure them or to estimate them by some common acceptable public standard, I say. And I think it's an important feature of the utilitarian view that it does not assume that they are incommensurable. So if we have time to talk about that view, it is an example of a view which I think can be read as denying incommensurability of different exceptions of the good. So if you make this assumption, although of course you have to justify it, you are in a way opposing or taking a different standpoint than the utilitarian view. And I think of this assumption that citizens have irreconcilable and incommensurable conceptions of the good as historical facts that have existed and have made since the Reformation. And we're taking that for granted. We're not questioning it on some assumption with which you might disagree. That the only way to overcome that condition would be by the autocratic use of state power. Now, the general view kind of behind this is that although political philosophy can help us reach some kind of agreement, at least that's the hope, on a political conception of justice, that is the moral conception to apply to basic structures of the Constitution and things like that. The presumption is, I haven't argued for this, and I'm more hint to argue for it, but the presumption is that what philosophy could not do would be to be able to show that one conception of the good, and remember that those include religious, metaphysical, moral doctrines as to how certain ends are being interpreted, that what philosophy cannot do is to show that one of those is the best sufficiently clearly to secure public agreement about it. Now, it's not being said that there is not some conception of good which is best. TJ never says that. And you want to avoid, which I do, very much resting political conception of justice on the denial of anything like that, on skepticism or indifference about values, just speak vaguely. You are not denying those views. And importantly, you want to deny as few things as you can. You want to avoid philosophical issues if you can. So it isn't being denied that there is a best conception of the good. What is being assumed is that philosophy can't show which one is best sufficiently clearly to gain free agreement of a wide enough kind to be the basis of a political conception of justice, which is, I think, a rather different assumption. Anyway, that's what's supposed to be in the background. Well, I was going to say something about the mutual disinterestedness of the parties. I think perhaps I'll skip over that. Also, pass on then to 23 with the formal constraints of the concept of right. These constraints are a good example, and they exemplify the idea of how the OP in original position incorporates reasonable constraints on arguments for principles of justice. These conditions are among the conditions which ensure that the parties have to assess principles and agree to them from a suitably general point of view. So, in that sense, they are among the constraints on arguments, and they illustrate this general point, which is behind a lot of what's going on in chapter 3 and this fourth interpretation of original positions. Now, all of these 5 constraints are familiar, except possibly for publicity. I might just call your attention about that. It's introduced here, and this isn't clearly enough explained in the text, as it ought to have been. It should have been more identified as the one of the 5 that's not, you might say, often discussed. It is a condition that is laid down on arguments for political principles, that is to say, for principles of justice for the basic structure that are going to be part of a political conception. It only holds for those, of which may be a quite different thing, I think is a quite different thing, from saying that they hold for moral principles generally, or whatever the moral principles. That would be a much broader application of this formal condition, and we don't need to say that. So it's only saying what we have to say. And I think in the case of political institutions, it's not an unreasonable condition for various reasons. That political institutions exercise and have behind them the power of the state, they have exercise a monopoly and favor sense of force and so on within the law, and it is desirable, and one might see the point of, and would be reflected in our reasonable convictions, that those institutions and the principles that stand behind them should be public. And indeed, when we come to Marx, you might say that if the principles that underlie political institutions and how they operate are publicly known, if people have assessed them in various ways from standpoint of original position and so on, and various other conditions that I won't try to mention now, then we might say, well, that would be a society without ideological consciousness in Marx's sense, where I take ideological consciousness to mean false consciousness, then in some way defective from the standpoint either of reasonableness or rationality, to use the terms that I've been using. We might say that public principles that the conception of justice can operate and be accepted, meeting that condition is necessary requirement if ideological consciousness in Marx's sense is to be avoided. So I think it will turn out that publicity is an important condition and has interesting consequences. And what it means essentially is that the parties have to assess principles that they're going to agree to in terms of the consequences of their being publicly recognized and mutually accepted by members of society and so on. In other words, the contrast is that some principles might work okay if it was just the case that nobody knew that those were the principles that were being applied or that institutions satisfied. But here they have to work okay even when one has this public knowledge that there are the underlying reasons that people accept and appraise their institutions in the light of. So that's the only point, I think, which needs to be emphasized or called to attention in chapter 3. We go on to the veil of ignorance, 24. Now the opening section of this, the opening sentence of this section, namely that the idea of the OP is to set up a fair procedure so that the principles agreed to are just, in a sense that we've already covered in handout 2, the earlier part of that 2.1. So I'll stress again that in this section you get the idea of the original position as incorporating constraints on arguments. So the same idea is here repeated on page 138 and 9. Now, many questions about the original position answer themselves if we keep this fourth use in mind. And remember earlier I suggested that we could view it as characterizing a reasoning game of some kind. That is, what we're doing is characterizing how certain people would reason in line with certain constraints. So view that as a reasoning game. Now suppose we do that, then one might ask certain questions like, well, is it an assembly? Is it an assembly at one moment of time of all persons who exist or be alive at any moment of time? Or is it an assembly of all possible persons or something of that sort? Then you want to say, no, of course not. You might say, well, when can we enter it? Or when do we enter it? And you say, well, when do we enter or play a game like a Monopoly? When can I be owner of boardwalk in Park Place and so forth? Well, if we play the game of Monopoly or something, why then I can do it. So analogously, we can simulate this position or entering it in the sense that if we reason with somebody, or even if we imagine we're reflecting it for ourselves in light of these constraints, then in a figurative sense, we can say we're entering that position. If we think of it as reflecting in this form, in this visual form, that is in this visual form, I'm thinking of the imagery that is provided of this notion, then if you think of it as a reasoning game, that's a way of answering certain questions and saying that, well, they have to answer in a certain kind of way. Or if one says, well, how could I reason? How could the parties reason if they didn't know who they were? Did they suffer from amnesia or something of that sort? So, well, if they suffer from amnesia, then who knows what else might have gone wrong? So how can we reason? And you say, well, that's all irrelevant, just like similar questions to what might be the case about other rules that you're asked to follow. I mean, if I owned Boardwalk, Park Place, so forth and so on, all those things, I might transform in all kinds of ways and so on if I got into that thought. I might think I was a landowner and stuff. Well, all that's irrelevant. Right? Don't think of it, if you're tempted to take it too realistically, in other words, think of it in this other way. and think what the answer there might be. Well, I think it's 3 o'clock. I was just going to say something about the rationality of the parties. I think perhaps the only thing that needs to be said, but I really ought to try to do so, is something about this account of primary goods, which we haven't yet mentioned anything about. I'll try to say something about that I guess on Friday it is. The important thing is just that the account of primary goods is not going to be simply, and the text of the TJ is very clear about this, and I've tried to clear it up since. It's not purely a psychological account. It doesn't depend on what people happen to want under various circumstances. It depends in part on psychology, but a very important element of it is that we can see of the persons represented as free and equal persons. And so primary goods are going to be the kind of things that free and equal persons need, and that free and equal persons in general have to have if they're to carry out most any conception of the good within a wide range. And so importantly, they will be the kinds of things that the two principles of justice of themselves actually make provision for. So the main point actually is just that the primary goods are going to be connected in part with some conception of the person that stands in the background and with the needs, the status of citizens as such persons. So it will not be purely a psychological theory, but primary goods are going to be connected with a conception of a person that is designed to be part of a political conception of justice. So again, it will be, in that sense, it will be a notion that belongs in the broad sense of moral philosophy and to political philosophy in particular, and not just a psychological notion. Okay? I'll stop there, and I have a handout here that I'll put it on the table. There are, let's see,